Chapter 141, Unforeseen Developments. I understand, but no one knows where that guy is now. I asked around a bit during Christmas, but even his family seems to be in the dark, Rosier added. Be cautious. It's better to be prepared than caught off guard, Anduin advised, pulling out a large bundle of wands from his interspatial bag and handing them to Rosier. These are the wands of those guys. Take them back and return them. Once I've copied these books, I'll return the originals. Tell them that I am a man of my word, and I expect them to be the same. He then handed Rosier 20 galleons. This is your share. Don't relax just yet. Keep a close eye on those guys. Seeing the money, Rosier's expression softened into a slight smile, and he readily agreed to Anduin's request. After dismissing Rosier, Anduin examined Yaxley's wand. It was made of brown sorbet wood with a dragon heartstring core and measured 11 inches. It seemed to be in good condition. It seems your master has abandoned you. In that case, you'll be my spare wand. I hope you won't be as disrespectful as your master. Anduin sneered at the wand. As for Yaxley, since he hadn't gone home, he had probably joined other Death Eaters, which satisfied Anduin. Meanwhile, in the headmaster's office at Hogwarts, two people were also discussing Yaxley. So, Yaxley is missing? Dumbledore asked Snape while feeding Fawkes. Yes, after he used the killing curse on Anduin that day, I sensed something was off. I kept an eye on him, but Yaxley didn't return to his family. Instead, he went to Diagon Alley, where I lost track of him. I've been trying to locate him, but I can only narrow down the area. I can't pinpoint his exact location, Snape replied indifferently. What's your assessment? Dumbledore asked, tilting his head. He wasn't in a good state at the time. I feared he might do something irrational, so I followed him closely but didn't dare to reveal myself. I've been using super sense spells to track him. With his abilities, he can't evade my surveillance, even with apparition. I suspect someone is helping him, Snape explained. As I predicted, it seems those exiles haven't given up. It's unfortunate we couldn't catch them. The first place Yaxley went after the incident wasn't his family, but to them. It seems he's completely lost, Dumbledore said, saddened by another student's fall from grace. Tch, Snape sneered. I think you're really getting old, still caring about a would-be Death Eater. The Dark Lord has fallen. We must try to win over every wizard, especially since he's still a minor, Dumbledore said, turning to Snape. By the way, check Diagon Alley. Judging by Yaxley's behavior, there should be a Death Eater stronghold there. You don't need to remind me, but Diagon Alley is a mixed bag of good and bad people. Many properties belong to pure-blood families. I'm not an Auror. I can't just break in and search, Snape retorted. Give me the approximate location, and I'll ask Moody to think of a way. But the effect may not be great, and Millicent is currently under a lot of pressure, Dumbledore said. Huh? Snape looked at Dumbledore suspiciously. Isn't she very prestigious now? The Dark Lord fell during her tenure, and there are rumors that she might become one of the greatest ministers in British history. Don't you support her? Indeed, the current situation isn't bad, but it's not as optimistic as it seems. The main problem lies within the Ministry of Magic. In the Wizengamot, many families that originally supported her have become neutral or even started helping those who sided with the Death Eaters. After all, they are all pure bloods, and many Death Eaters can't even be convicted, Dumbledore explained. Millicent is now competing with them, Dumbledore said, frowning slightly. It's the same old power play of checks and balances. It's not surprising that there's no external pressure, Snape replied with a contemptuous curl of his lips. He then asked, So, according to you, those wanted Death Eaters might be hidden by them? I can't rule out that possibility. I'm supporting Millicent in putting pressure on those families so they can't just cover up these criminals. We have many friends, but it will take some time, Dumbledore explained. What about Yaxley? Are we just going to let him go? Snape inquired. I'll let the Order of the Phoenix handle his situation. However, those young wizards who were bewitched by him must be terrified. They are now accessories to murder, Dumbledore said with a slight smile. It's thanks to Anduin that they are now being blackmailed by the ghosts of our snake yard. Snape paused. And, I could feel that day. He found me. Oh? Dumbledore raised an eyebrow. The main reason is that I didn't expect Yaxley to be so bold. When he used the killing curse, I was taken aback and almost stopped him, but Anduin reacted very quickly. He's aware of my presence, Snape said in a low voice. Then, he dared to blatantly threaten those young wizards. It seems he wants to see our reaction. After thinking for a while, Dumbledore said, "It's better not to encourage this kind of behavior. You should take some time to talk to him. Let's talk about it after a while. It's good to let them suffer a little bit. But it's really reckless to openly create a split in Slytherin," Snape said, his anger rising as he thought of the chaos in the college during the first half of the school year. "This is a matter for Slytherin House. Naturally, it's up to you. Anduin should know how to handle it," Dumbledore said, not pressing further. "He knows how to handle it. He only used basic spells and self-defense spells to deal with those young wizards and didn't let them shed a drop of blood. Afterwards, he even used potions to heal their wounds. He handled it so professionally that I bet he must have planned it in advance," Snape recalled. From the beginning to the end, Anduin had always acted calmly, as if he had rehearsed beforehand. How could this not surprise him? However, he didn't know exactly what happened in the hut that day. A shielding spell was cast there, and he thought Anduin used potions to heal those young wizards. End of this chapter. Chapter 142, The Incapacitating Curse. "Should I say that you are indeed a Slytherin? You should be happy. This is a talent in your house," Dumbledore joked, then added, "This also proves that he at least knows what should and shouldn't be done, which is a quality worth affirming." "I can't stand such a talent, as long as he doesn't cause me trouble," Snape retorted insincerely, but Dumbledore caught the faint joy in his eyes. "Anyway, you should take some time to pay attention to Anduin. After Lily and the Longbottom couple, who have a good relationship with him, had an accident, I was a little worried that he would lose control. It seems that Anduin can still manage his emotions," Dumbledore said, his years of experience with magic making him acutely aware of how much drastic changes in mood can affect wizards. Hearing Dumbledore mention Lily's name, Snape's face darkened immediately. He responded with a grunt before turning his head and leaving the office. Seeing this, Dumbledore could only shake his head helplessly. The next month passed peacefully. Since those pure-blood wizards had succumbed and Yaxley, the seventh-year prefect and president of the student council, had fled, the atmosphere in Slytherin had undergone a significant change. Under Anduin's initiative, the Purity Committee was abolished, and the confiscated Muggle items were returned. Those pure-blood wizards didn't dare to voice any objections at this time. After all, their leader was gone, and Anduin was still around. Now, the young pure-blood wizards would basically avoid Anduin whenever they saw him. Even Travers, who was originally the most troublesome, behaved the same way. Without the person who had been leading the trouble, the college returned to its former calm, and Vivienne's Mahjong Club reopened, with games flying high in the common room every day. However, although the interior of the college was calm, external conflicts were still fierce. In the latest Quidditch match, Gryffindor and Slytherin turned it into an armed fight, and the tension between the two houses was palpable. The young pure-blood wizards vented all their frustrations on Gryffindor, and the pranks between the two houses almost never stopped. But these issues did not concern Anduin. He was currently preoccupied with a newly developed spell. The freezing spell he had used in the previous battle in Hogsmeade had given him a lot of inspiration. Using the knowledge he had accumulated during his study of temperature magic and magic driving magic, he developed a new spell with special functions. He named this new spell the Incapacity Curse. He combined the principles of hypothermia and magic power flow to reconstruct a spell that could actively drain a person's magical power. In his vision, a wizard or magical item cast with such a spell would gradually lose its magical power over time until it completely lost both physical strength and magical power. Initially, his idea was to develop an energy-absorbing curse that could absorb the magic power of others for his own use. However, this seemed to involve a lot of knowledge about blood magic, which was currently a blind spot in his knowledge. Although there was a lot of content about blood magic in the materials submitted by the young wizards, the accumulation was still insufficient, so he first made a simplified version. The trouble now was that this spell was difficult to test and experiment with, mainly because there were no suitable test subjects. He had already tested the spell on magical items, but he still needed to test it on living beings. Since it was a disabling spell, he needed a target with magical power. Ordinary small animals wouldn't suffice, as they didn't have enough magical power reserves to observe the effects, and larger magical animals were hard to find. There were quite a few magical biomes outside the Forbidden Forest, but those were taken care of by Hagrid, and Anduin didn't want to trouble him. In fact, the ideal test subject would be a wizard, but using acquaintances for such training was out of the question. Even if the research experiments fail, at least they can strengthen your body. Experimenting with spells is risky. The scene where he tested the infrasonic spell was still vivid in his memory. He had learned his lesson. Just when he was in trouble, someone knocked on the door of the dormitory. Anduin retracted his thoughts and opened the door to find Velen standing there. Anduin, don't stay in your room all day. Today is the weekend. I have an appointment with Vivienne to go to Hogsmeade to relax. You can come too, Velen said, clearly in a good mood. Recently, the leader of the college had managed to diminish the dominance of the pureblood faction on the Dicky team, allowing Velen to return to being a seeker. Anduin bowed his head and pondered for a moment. He felt that it would be good to relax a little and change his mood, so he nodded in agreement. After solving the issue with Yaxley, Anduin could go out of school relatively safely, but he was used to shutting himself up and doing research, so he hadn't really visited Hogsmeade yet. After the three of them gathered, they walked out of Hogwarts. The weather was still cold, and they stepped on the thick snow as the cold wind blew on their faces, refreshing their spirits. Along the way, Vivienne introduced Hogsmeade to Anduin in a lively manner. Every shop was so precious to her that it annoyed Anduin. It even made him miss the taciturn Vivienne that Millie pretended to be. After arriving in Hogsmeade, Vivienne reintroduced the shops like a broken record. Look, that's Zonko's magical joke shop. Last time, I bought Charles a dozen burp candies. You should have seen him make a fool of himself. And there's Mrs. Puttifoot's tea house. Although the decorations are a bit tacky, the drinks are delicious. Vivienne almost repeated what she had said on the way. Anduin, who was wandering around with Vivienne, seemed to have discovered something at that moment and walked straight in one direction. Seeing this, Vivienne and Velen looked at each other and followed. Anduin walked to the corner of the Hogsmeade Road, where a dilapidated house that looked like a pub stood. "What's the matter? What are you doing here? You probably don't want to go in," Vivienne said, looking at the broken bar with a look of disgust. She then explained, "This is the Hog's Head bar. The boss inside is a weirdo, and it's dirty and smelly. Everyone inside hides their faces mysteriously. I tell you, I won't go in." Anduin didn't want to go in and spend money, but the bar looked very familiar to him, bringing back memories. He remembered that he and Sirius had participated in a secret meeting of the Order of the Phoenix before Christmas in the 1st grade. The meeting was held in a dilapidated storage room, and the style of the place was very similar to this bar. Chapter 143, The Looking Glass. Is this the secret place where the Order of the Phoenix met back then? Such a thought emerged in Anduin's mind, piquing his curiosity about the place. "It's nothing. I'm just a little curious about why such a dilapidated store hasn't closed down yet," Anduin said, coming back to his senses. He turned to Vivienne, offering a perfunctory explanation, and then began to walk away. "Ha! Don't be fooled by its shabby appearance. This store has a history of hundreds of years. It's even recorded in the history of magic that the Pig's Head Bar was once the headquarters of the Goblin Rebellion," Vivienne said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm for history. But before she could finish her boast, she noticed that Anduin had already walked away, ignoring her completely. Frustrated, she stamped her foot in annoyance. Anduin set aside his curiosity and entered a nearby business store named Devise and Band's Store, which specialized in various magical equipment and tools. He even spotted an alchemy carving knife on a shelf, though it was covered in dust, indicating a lack of interest from customers. The most popular items in the store were Quidditch-related equipment. A group of young wizards was gathered around the Nimbus 1500, and the two brooms that swept 6 stars, their eyes gleaming with desire. Vivienne and Velen were also drawn to the broomsticks, but Anduin had no interest in them. He glanced at the price tag of the broom and then turned to inspect other products. He thought it would be more worthwhile to buy another rune plate with that money. He meticulously examined each magical prop on the shelves, picking them up one by one, studying them, and then putting them back. Many of the items had runes engraved on them, providing Anduin with a wealth of inspiration. However, some props used dark engraved runes, making it impossible to study them without a harmless hammer to break them open. He dared not do such a thing, as it would surely anger the shopkeeper. It seems I need to create an alchemy prop that can penetrate materials and observe spells. Otherwise, how will I learn from others in the future? Anduin muttered to himself. After examining all the products on the shelf, he decided to buy a looking glass. The shopkeeper's disapproving glare made him feel obligated to purchase something, and he was genuinely interested in studying the early warning properties of the looking glass. My father told me in a letter that if I can successfully make the Quidditch school team next year, he'll give me a Nimbus 1500, Anduin overheard Vivienne saying to Velen as he approached them. Why buy the Nimbus series? Isn't the broom from the Sweeping series better for control? Sweeping 6 stars is a good choice in terms of speed and stability, Velen suggested. What do you know? The Nimbus series brooms are so flexible. They can make a 360-degree sharp turn anywhere in the sky, and their top speed is faster than the Sweeping 6 stars, Vivienne retorted. You girl, why do you want such a sensitive broom? You must know that when you're in the air, if you don't control it well, you could be thrown off. Moreover, during a Quidditch match, there will be a lot of interference from other players. The Quidditch field is so big that most of the time, you don't need to push the broom to its extreme speed. Only the Seeker's position requires such a fast and flexible broom. Why would you need it as a beater? Velen, who was a Seeker himself, shared his experience sensibly. I don't care, I want it. Look at how handsome this broom is. Sweeping 6 stars looks dull and isn't cool at all, Vivienne insisted stubbornly. Anduin turned her head and said, This is the real reason for you to buy things. Being cool can only prove that you have a high drag coefficient. If you want to be cool, it will be more exciting to hold an umbrella while riding a broom. Anduin played with the looking glass in his hand, secretly mocking the discussion between the two. Suddenly, the spinning top-shaped speculum in Anduin's hand Ted, spinning continuously and emitting a bright light. His heart tensed, and he quickly raised his head to look around. When he scanned the window, he saw a figure staring at him with malicious eyes outside the store. The figure quickly stepped aside when Anduin looked at him. Travers, does that guy hate me so much that even the looking glass reacted? Although it was only for a moment, Anduin recognized the figure. After thinking for a while, Anduin frowned and had an idea. He turned to Velen and Vivienne, explaining that he had something to do and would meet them at the 3 broomsticks later. The two didn't notice anything unusual and continued their enthusiastic discussion about broomsticks. Anduin put away the looking glass and walked out of the shop. He could still see Travers in the distance. Nodding thoughtfully, he found a secluded corner, cast the disillusionment charm on himself, and manipulated his magic to float, following Travers. At this time, Rosier walked out of the Honeyduke's candy store with a bag of candies and saw Travers with an unnatural expression. What's the matter? Didn't you say you were going to devise in bands to buy the latest windproof glasses? You came back so soon? Rosier asked curiously, noticing Travers had nothing in his hands. Forget it. I happened to run into that mudblood in Devison bands. Damn it! Travers panted and complained. Rosier immediately knew who he was referring to. Since Christmas, Travers had been avoiding Anduin. Although he was honest when paying the protection fee, he never said anything good about Anduin. Every day, Rosier saw him cursing Anduin maliciously. If it were popular in the British magical world to stab voodoo dolls, Anduin's doll would be full of needles. Rosier sighed and said, It's okay to avoid him. If you have nothing to do, don't provoke him. Otherwise, you'll only suffer. Rosier's attempt to comfort Travers had the opposite effect. I don't agree. How can that dirty mudblood be so nonchalant while we avoid him? Have you forgotten how he humiliated us? Travers yelled at Rosier emotionally. Why are you yelling so loudly? Rosier muttered, shaking his head. End of this chapter. Half Sharp, chapter 144. Rosier glanced left and right, relieved to see no one around. He quickly pulled Travers away from the street and walked briskly towards the outskirts of the village. As they moved, he kindly advised, "Didn't we start the trouble with him first? It seems he has never taken the initiative to bother us. Maybe we should just stop for a while. Haven't you noticed that whenever we have anything to do with him, we are always the ones who end up unlucky? That's because that guy is too cunning. Don't let me find a chance, or he will die without a place to bury him," Travers said angrily. "Come on, you see, he doesn't come to trouble us, and we don't bother him. Isn't it better to live in peace?" Rosier just wanted to live a peaceful life, but it seemed so difficult. That guy is actually a bad person. Maybe he's thinking about how to deal with us right now. Travers shouted excitedly. "Indeed, but is it really that obvious?" "Of course it is. As soon as I saw that guy's face, I knew he was full of evil thoughts. Travers trailed off, suddenly realizing something was wrong. That wasn't Rosier's voice. Both of them quickly looked around, realizing they had gradually left the range of Hogsmeade. The path they were on was deserted, surrounded by snow and woods. Where did that third voice come from? Just as they wondered if they had misheard, a figure appeared out of thin air in the open space ahead. It was Anduin, who had just dispelled his illusion spell. He had followed them all the way, using extraordinary levitation to avoid leaving footprints. However, he realized his caution was unnecessary, as the two were too engrossed in their conversation to notice anything. Seeing Anduin's sudden appearance, Travers, full of anger, reached for his wand to attack. But Anduin didn't give him the chance. With a swift flick of his wand, Travers' robe seemed to come alive, binding his limbs tightly like a mummy. "You don't even have a permanent anti-polymorph charm on your equipment. You really are worthless," Anduin said coldly. On the other side, Rosier nervously pointed his wand at Anduin and shouted, "Don't come any closer. What do you want?" Travers, tightly wrapped, shouted in a muffled voice, "Rosier, shoot him, quick!" Anduin turned his wand towards Rosier and cast a spell lightly. Rosier let out a loud "ah" and flew backwards, landing hard. Anduin couldn't help but curl his lips in amusement. His spell hadn't been that powerful, and with Travers' face covered, Rosier's dramatic reaction was clearly an act. Ignoring Rosier, who pretended to faint after his exaggerated fall, Anduin walked towards the writhing Travers. With a slight flick of his wand, the robe loosened around Travers' face, revealing his hideous expression. "I just need a favor from you today. Don't worry, I'll be gentle," Anduin said with a wicked smile. Travers was about to curse, but Anduin pointed his wand again, sealing his lips together. All Travers could manage were weak, muffled sounds. Rosier lay on the ground, watching Anduin drag Travers by the collar into the depths of the woods. After a while, faint whimpers of sadness could be heard. Rosier couldn't help but swallow nervously, imagining some weird scenario. He turned over from lying on his buttocks to lying on his back on the ground. After a while, Anduin emerged from the woods, looking satisfied. He felt a bit speechless when he saw Rosier still lying down, wondering if he was cold. He lay in the snow, not wanting to disturb Rosier's performance. Recasting the disillusionment charm on himself, he quietly made his way back to Hogsmeade. After some time, Rosier, unable to withstand the cold any longer, got up and ventured into the woods to check on Travers. Upon entering the woods, Rosier found Travers sobbing on the ground, his clothes disheveled. The sight made Rosier shiver. "Travers, are you okay?" Rosier asked cautiously as he approached. "Don't ask," Travers snapped, lifting his head to reveal red, tear-filled eyes. "I swear I will never let that mudblood go. Never." Rosie, taken aback by Travers's intense expression and state, could only nod in agreement. He didn't dare to provoke Travers further. Meanwhile, Anduin, who was walking back invisibly, was engrossed in his notebook, jotting down observations and thoughts. In addition to the loss of magic power, does the cursed living body exhibit symptoms such as a drop in body temperature, fatigue, limb weakness, and anxiety? No, anxiety might be unique to Travers and needs further confirmation. The rate of magic power loss is measured by timing. For a standard third-year student, it takes roughly 5 minutes. If the standard base is to cast Expelliarmus once, an ordinary third-year student can cast it 60 to 70 times in a row without a break, equating to 60 to 70 bases. However, this data was previously collected from Charles, whose mana reserve is much stronger after a year of training. So the constant is calculated based on 50 bases. This means the disabling curse can cause the target to lose 10 bases in 1 minute, averaging 6 seconds per base. From this perspective, the efficiency is not high. It seems we need a way to measure the reserve of magic power and establish a standard unit for it. Otherwise, the accuracy of data collection remains low, essentially an estimation. Why has the magical world never considered this issue? It's quite a headache. As Anduin walked towards the 3 broomsticks, he continued recording and pondering the experimental data he had just gathered. Suddenly, something caught his eye. A beetle emerged from a wall and scurried past the invisible Anduin at a remarkable speed, heading towards a corner on the opposite side of the street. A beetle? In this season? Anduin stared at it in surprise. End of this chapter. Hotter Chapter 145, The Illegal Animagus. It was a mere glance, but it led Anduin to discover something miraculous. A beetle crawled into the shadow of a corner, circled for a while, and then suddenly transformed into a fashionable young woman. She glanced left and right to confirm that no one had noticed her, drew her wand, and apparated away. An animagus? Anduin muttered to himself. Animagus is an extremely advanced form of transfiguration, and Anduin recognized it immediately. Professor McGonagall was an animagus, but this kind of magic is notoriously difficult to master. Failure can have severe consequences, which is why the Ministry of Magic strictly prohibits wizards from studying it privately. All animagi must register with the Ministry. Anduin recalled reading in the Transfiguration Daily that there were only 7 registered animagi in the current British magical community. None of them, to his knowledge, could transform into a beetle. Curious, Anduin turned his head to look at the place where the animagus had emerged. It was a private residence with the surname Elcott on the house number. There was no other information available. An illegal animagus thief? Anduin wondered. But she didn't look like one. Maybe she was spying on someone? He shook his head, deciding it was none of his business. He wasn't going to meddle in other people's affairs. Putting the incident behind him, he continued walking towards the 3 Broomsticks bar. Velen and Vivienne were already waiting for him at the bar, and they had even ordered a glass of butterbeer for him in advance. After taking his seat, Anduin drank with them, enjoying the bar's atmosphere and listening to Vivienne talk about Quidditch and her Mahjong Club gossip. The 3 of them spent a relaxing weekend together, and Anduin felt that it was good to unwind once in a while. On Monday, Anduin saw the new issue of the Daily Prophet and finally understood the significance of the beetle he had seen. The headline read, "The Secret Love History Between the Former Senior Law Enforcement Officer and the Hogwarts Transfiguration Professor." So the house I passed that day was actually Professor McGonagall's home? The illegal animagus I saw must have been Rita Skeeter, the reporter who wrote this article. She used her animagus form to sniff out gossip? Incredible, Anduin thought. The newspaper revealed that Professor McGonagall had recently married Elphinstone Elcott, a former senior official of the Ministry of Magic, and had moved to Hogsmeade with him. Elcott had been Professor McGonagall's boss at the Ministry's law enforcement department, and it appeared that she had accepted his marriage proposal last summer. The article delved into their private lives, noting that Professor McGonagall had kept her surname after marriage and that Elcott had bought a house in Hogsmeade to make it easier for her to commute to Hogwarts. The report painted Professor McGonagall as a tsundere queen and Elcott as an old suitor who had been chasing his goddess for years. Rita Skeeter is really brave, digging up such thorough details. Isn't she afraid of being attacked in the middle of the night? Anduin speculated teasingly. Although he had accidentally discovered Rita Skeeter's secret, he wasn't planning to reveal it. He might be able to use this information to his advantage in the future. The gossip about Professor McGonagall spread quickly through Hogwarts, and she had a dark expression on her face all day. It was no wonder, given the invasion of her privacy. The details of her home were not only made public, but her image was also portrayed as that of an indifferent and arrogant woman. Recently, Professor McGonagall hasn't even been reading the Daily Prophet. This report became a talking point among all the young wizards at Hogwarts for a while, although of course they dared not bring it up in front of Professor McGonagall. Anduin, however, didn't pay much attention to it, except for a moment of surprise when he first saw it. He had more important things to focus on. In the Forbidden Forest cabin, Anduin frowned, deep in thought. He had been researching various materials in the library, trying to find a way to measure the reserve of magical power. After testing, the output of magical power can be measured, but the output doesn't seem to be directly related to the reserve of magical power. So, where should I start? Anduin pondered, flipping through his experiment notes, trying to find a thread in the mess. Recently, he had created another alchemy prop that could roughly test the magic power output ratio. Each young wizard could output different amounts of magic power per second, depending on their physique and state. He had considered whether the magic power output was related to their reserves, but after testing, he found little correlation. The output of magic power was only related to the wizard's physique, learning, and training level. It seems I need to seek help. My own knowledge reserves are not enough to solve such problems, Anduin concluded after some thought. He then pulled out a piece of parchment, ready to communicate with spell scholars. Since his Echo Spellper was published, he had aroused the interest of many scholars in the spell research and alchemy circles, leading to numerous correspondences. One of his correspondents was Pandora Lovegood, wife of Xenophilius Lovegood. As a scholar of charms, Mrs. Lovegood had a wealth of knowledge, and she soon became an academic pen pal of Anduin. Anduin described his ideas and the difficulties he encountered in his research, preparing to send his thoughts to several scholars, including Professor Burns. He hoped that insights from other scholars might provide some inspiration. Xunfeng, your food seems to be a bit too good recently. Be careful of high blood fat. I'll give you a chance to exercise with these letters. Anduin said to his owl, Xunfeng, who had a rather individual character. Every time Anduin wanted to send a letter, he had to coax Xunfeng into doing it, which always gave him a headache. End of this chapter. Chapter 146. The Duel. Just as Anduin promised Xunfeng an extra meal after the flight, there was a knock on the door of the hut. When he opened it, he found Charles and Velen standing there. Anduin looked at them with some puzzlement. The training for these individuals had become quite routine recently, and he no longer needed to supervise them closely. They usually conducted their own inspections and collected test data. So what brought them here today? What's the matter? Anduin asked, ignoring Xunfeng's emotions as he stuffed a stack of envelopes into its mouth. Velen spoke first. We've been training for more than half a year now, and I want to have another duel to test the results of our training. Charles nodded in agreement. Oh, so they want to challenge each other again? Anduin thought. He could see the fighting spirit in their eyes and understood their plan. After a moment of consideration, he nodded. All right, let me see how your current level is. Seeing Anduin agree, the two were thrilled. After so much training, they were very confident in their own strength. Velen, who was 2 grades higher than Charles, felt that he had lost the last duel due to poor dueling skills and was eager to get back on the field. This duel was his idea. Charles, on the other hand, had gained enough confidence from the last duel. In his eyes, the so-called seniors were not as formidable as he had thought. This time, he was ready to give it his all. The 3 of them walked out of the hut and came to the open space nearby. Vivienne, Bill, and Ibrahimovic had already prepared candy and drinks and were waiting to watch the show. Looking at the 3 spectators, Anduin said, You 3 should also be more serious. This is a good opportunity to observe. After your training progresses further, I will arrange for you to practice in pairs. Yeah, the 3 responded perfunctorily, their eyes shining with excitement. Bill even took out a large lollipop and started gnawing on it. Humph, Anduin thought to himself, then turned his attention to the 2 duelists standing in the arena. I won't impose any restrictions on you for this duel, but be careful. Now you may salute. The 2 nodded, drew their wands, and performed a standard dueling salute. After the ceremony, their faces became more serious, each putting the other on equal footing. Locking the tongue and sealing the throat, and many obstacles, they shouted, choosing different spells to attack. Charles used Lock Tongue Sealing Throat, trying to use this flexible spell to launch an initial attack. If successful, it could block Velen's vocal spells. Even if it didn't work, it could disrupt Velen's rhythm with its fast ballistic speed. Velen, on the other hand, chose many obstacles, aiming to use this spell's larger attack range to force Charles to move. After casting their spells, the two moved instantly. Thanks to Anduin's long training, they could move and cast spells relatively freely. Their initial spells missed, and a series of continuous spells followed. Both showed impressive spell-casting techniques, with attacks coming in rapid succession. Within a few seconds, several spells were shot from both sides. After nearly 10 seconds of intense spellcasting, neither side had gained an advantage. However, in Anduin's view, there was still a noticeable gap between the two. Charles was clearly inferior to Velen in terms of spellcasting accuracy. Velen often used a method of jerking and stopping to make his movements unpredictable, giving him a slight edge in the duel. Charles struggled to gain the upper hand, making it difficult to defend against Velen's spells. Most of the time, he had to dodge them, which, although exhausting, allowed him to maintain a slight advantage. Despite Charles's agility, Velen's precise aiming often forced him to delay his attacks and deflect incoming spells. This led to a prolonged stalemate where Charles found himself on the defensive more often than not. On the sidelines, Vivian, Bill, and Ibrahim watched with keen interest, munching on snacks as they observed the duel. They were impressed by the quick reflexes of both duelists, who dodged curses by moving left and right and counterattacked with their wands at lightning speed. It was then that they realized the purpose behind Anduin's rigorous training routines, such as lateral jumps and rapid spellcasting. The effectiveness of these exercises was clearly demonstrated in this intense duel. As the duel continued, both Charles and Velen began to show signs of fatigue. Velen's constant movement and abrupt stops were draining his stamina, while Charles knew he would eventually lose due to his younger age and smaller mana reserves. Realizing this, Charles shifted his strategy to prioritize defense. During a brief lull in the action, he pointed his wand at Velen's feet and cast a transfiguration spell. Velen, noticing that Charles had ceased his attacks, assumed his opponent was tiring. He paused to catch his breath, only to be caught off guard by Charles's sudden spell. Several clay hands emerged from the ground, firmly grasping Velen's feet. Seizing the opportunity, Charles quickly launched a series of spells: Stupefy, Expelliarmus, and Confringo, aiming to overwhelm Velen. Although momentarily panicked, Velen quickly regained his composure. Instead of hastily parrying the incoming spells, he cast Ventus, conjuring a gust of wind to kick up sand and obscure Charles's vision. This tactic, which had previously failed to disrupt Charles, now served to force him into a defensive position, buying Velen precious time. End of this chapter. Chapter 147, Hidden and Tracking Curses. After using flying sand and moving stone, Velen quickly set up the iron armor curse to shield himself and absorb the nearby spells. As expected, Charles, who was on the opposite side, covered his eyes and jumped sideways to avoid the flying sand. Seizing this opportunity, Velen used the reduction technique on the soles of his feet, releasing the transfiguration spell that had locked his legs. Finally regaining his freedom, Velen broke out in a cold sweat. He had almost been trapped, but there was no time to relax. Just as he was releasing the transfiguration, Charles, now out of the range of the flying sand, organized an offensive. A spell flew towards Velen, moving in a straight line. From the front, only the aura of the spell could be seen. A hidden curse? I won't be fooled by this tactic, Velen muttered, recognizing the trickiness of the situation. With Charles' attack speed, it was impossible that he had fired only one spell. There had to be a hidden spell behind the visible one. Simply using the iron armor curse to defend would be courting disaster. The hidden spell technique was something Anduin had taught them during spellcasting training. This technique wasn't original to Anduin. He had learned it from the book Spellcasting Techniques. When he fought Yaxley, he used 10,000 bullets to smash the clear water like a spring, showcasing the skill of hiding curses. Realizing the danger, Valen reacted quickly and moved to avoid the spell. He couldn't afford to stay in one place, especially since he wasn't as proficient in the transfiguration spell as Charles. To prevent being hit again, he had to keep moving. Meanwhile, the string of unknown spells continued to follow him under Charles' control. This tracking technique required constant guidance by the eyes and consumed a lot of mana, indicating that Charles was going all in. After dodging back and forth, Velen realized he couldn't shake off the pursuing spells. With a plan forming in his mind, he turned around and cast the Flock of Birds spell. Although he wasn't as skilled in control spells as Anduin, he could still direct the flock of birds in one direction. Over a dozen sparrows swarmed towards the spell, but only a few hit the leading aura. Boom! The leading spell in the series exploded first. It was a small thunderbolt explosion spell, which almost blew up the flock of birds. The few birds that escaped the explosion lost control and flew away. However, several spells still continued towards Velen unabated. The airwave from the explosion made it difficult for Velen to keep his eyes open, but he knew this was a critical moment. He couldn't afford any hesitation. Quickly diving to one side, Velen turned around and, without getting up, fired 2,000 bullets at the incoming spells. He feared losing his aim if he lost his balance, so he used this wide-range, fast-firing spell. The 1,000-bullet spell has two uses. The first is to launch a projectile attack composed of magic power like a shotgun, and the second is to act on objects, such as stones, which then split and sputter in one direction. This was the technique Anduin had used on the Qingquan Rushui curse before. At this moment, Valen was using the first method, hoping to counter the incoming spells with a barrage of magical projectiles. With a resounding bang and another bang, two magic spells were cast. Although the aim was slightly off, Velen managed to intercept the flying magic spell. Immediately afterward, two explosive sounds, pop and pop, echoed as the spells collided mid-air, triggering a burst of magical energy that dissipated into the surroundings. Before Velen could breathe a sigh of relief, another concealed spell emerged from the aftermath of the previous two. It continued its trajectory towards him. A quadruple curse? Do you really need to go this hard? Velen thought, exasperated. He was already exhausted. By his estimates, Charles must be in an even worse state. Remotely controlling spells is no easy task. As long as Velen could block this spell, victory would be his. Determined, he sat up and mustered the last of his magical energy to cast an Iron Armor curse. This one was noticeably weaker than his previous attempts, but it should suffice to block the final spell. With a ping, the Iron Armor curse successfully intercepted the incoming stunning curse. However, before Velen could celebrate, another spell emerged from the dissipating magical aura. The repelling curse struck Velen's already weakened Iron Armor curse, shattering the protective barrier in less than a second. The powerful impact sent Velen flying, rolling through the air, before crashing back to the ground. Dazed and confused, Velen could only think, 5 consecutive curses. Outside the field, the trio of spectators who had been watching intently were shocked and prepared to rush in to help. But Anduin stopped them. "The winner hasn't been decided yet," he said calmly. "Huh?" The trio was surprised. They had seen Velen get knocked down. Turning their attention to the other side of the field, they noticed that Charles was also lying on the ground, unconscious. They had been so focused on Velen's response that they hadn't noticed Charles's condition. Anduin, however, had observed it early on. When Velen cast the Iron Armor curse, Charles had already collapsed from exhaustion. Now, it was a matter of who would stand up first. Anduin had sensed that neither of them was seriously injured. They were merely exhausted. He decided not to interfere with the duel, waiting to confirm the final winner. Under Anduin's restraint, the trio remained still, watching the two fallen duelists. After a while, someone began to move. It was Velen. He had a physical advantage over Charles and wasn't seriously injured by the stunning curse, just a bit disoriented. As he gradually regained his senses, he struggled to his feet. "Well, it seems that Velen won," Anduin nodded. The trio then rushed to Charles, relieved to find that he was only exhausted. End of this chapter. Chapter 148, Bloodline Magic. "What's the matter? Haven't I been knocked down?" Velen asked in a daze as he looked at Charles lying on the ground not far away. Charles fell before you, and you woke up first, so you won, Anduin said lightly. What? Yes, but in the end I still couldn't block his serial tracking spell, Velen replied, hurrying towards Charles while talking. At this time, Charles, who had been fed a few mouthfuls of tonics by Vivienne, finally came to his senses. He managed to get up and said with a wry smile, "It seems that I lost. Velen, your progress is really fast." Charles had accepted Velen's challenge because he had received training a year earlier than Velen and had defeated him once before. This gave him a psychological advantage. Unexpectedly, Velen had grown to this level in just a few years. Velen's agility, his handling of transfiguration, and his use of hidden spells were all very impressive. Velen shook his head in shame after hearing what Charles said. "No, I should be the loser. I'm 2 years older than you. You probably haven't even mastered the iron armor curse. I haven't seen you use it before. I still fought to the point of exhaustion in this advantageous situation. It is really not a victory. If you win, you win. Don't be ridiculous. According to you, if you meet someone younger than you on the battlefield, you have to commit suicide right away?" Anduin looked at the two people who were still being humble, feeling speechless. He made a final decision. After hearing Anduin's words, Velen could only pat his head in embarrassment. He realized that he hadn't thought of this when he challenged Charles earlier. "Senior Charles, the 5 consecutive spells you used at the end are really powerful. Can you teach me?" Bill ran out to interrupt, asking the question he was most concerned about. Hearing Bill mention his unique move, Charles suddenly showed a proud expression. "Ha, Anduin taught me that, but I'm still not very proficient in controlling it. It's always difficult to turn a corner. Only after a long period of endurance and control can one get started with this technique of channeling spells." It was clear that Charles had been working very hard in this area. However, when he heard that Charles was still proud despite his shortcomings, Anduin raised his foot and kicked him with a serious face. "I know I can't use it well and use it indiscriminately. Isn't that just bragging? You don't know how to combine it with the actual situation, and you use the wrong curse. Rigid thinking. Is this what I taught you?" Anduin scolded. After finishing speaking, Anduin grabbed a few people and entered the room. He replayed their duel on the blackboard on the wall and corrected their mistakes one by one. The people who thought the battle had been fought heartily were all downcast by Anduin's critique. Even Bill and Ibrahimovic bowed their heads nervously. Seeing this, Anduin knew that he was demanding too much from them. He let out a sigh of relief and said, "Okay, let's stop here today. I appreciate your efforts, but there are still many areas where you need to improve. I will gradually increase the intensity of training, including Bill and Ibrahimovic. You should be mentally prepared." After listening to Anduin's words, everyone couldn't help feeling bitter. They realized that more challenges awaited them. But looking at Anduin's serious face, they could only bite the bullet and accept it. After explaining the training matters, Anduin kicked them out. He took out a recording board, on which were the names of Velen and others. Behind the names were recorded many numbers with unknown meanings. The experimental data of the routine basic training is almost collected. Next, we have to look at the test data under the limit state. Unfortunately, the magic power reserve cannot be quantified, Anduin mused to himself. Otherwise, the data accuracy can be improved. For now, we can only use the estimated values for judgment. In fact, he had never let go of his research on magic sensitivity at the Charm Club, but his ambitions were greater. After 2 years of training, he had mastered how to increase the sensitivity of magic power. However, he still had no idea about the quantification of magic reserves and sensitivity. He planned to publish a book after thoroughly studying all of this. "Let's discuss it with Professor Flitwick. Maybe the professor can give me some advice," Anduin nodded, tidying up before walking out of the hut. Quantification of magic reserves? Professor Flitwick, who was busy preparing lessons, put down his pen and paper and looked up at Anduin standing at his desk. "Not bad," Anduin replied. He knew that Professor Flitwick was usually very busy, so he rarely came to bother him. However, his recent research had hit a bottleneck. Anduin then explained his thoughts to the professor. "Your idea is very unique, Do you want to study the effect of training on mana reserves? Professor Flitwick leaned back in his chair, contemplating for a moment before looking at Anduin. There are few people in the wizarding world who are interested in quantifying mana. After all, the magic power of most wizards is completely sufficient for daily life, so I have no research in this area. After a pause, Professor Flitwick, not wanting to dampen Anduin's enthusiasm, added, "However, I can give you some suggestions. You need to use monitor runes to measure the upper limit of a wizard's magic power. Have you tried that?" "I tried, but the manifestation of magic power in a wizard's body is very subtle, and the measurement accuracy is not reliable," Anduin explained. "Then you may have to use some blood magic," Flitwick suggested after a moment of thought. "Blood magic?" Anduin asked, intrigued. "That's right," Flitwick nodded. "Bloodline magic is a relatively unique category. It specializes in the study of the physique of magical creatures. Many wizard families have research in this area, mostly applied to curses. The research is very difficult and requires a lot of in vivo experiments." Professor Flitwick hesitated, looking at Anduin cautiously. "If you want to measure the magic power reserve in a wizard's body, it is best to use blood magic. However, much of this magic is very dangerous, akin to black magic, and I don't recommend you delve too deeply into it." After listening to the professor's words, Anduin had some calculations in his mind. There were records of blood magic in the books he had received from some pure-blood wizards. Why hadn't he thought of this before? At the same time, he also sensed Professor Flitwick's concern, so he calmly said, "Professor, don't worry. I will not act recklessly. If there is any difficulty in studying blood magic, I will report to you immediately. I won't mess around." End of this chapter. Chapter 149, Summer Vacation. After contemplating for a while, Flitwick nodded. In his eyes, Anduin was a cautious and determined person, so he tacitly approved of his research. With a plan in mind, the next step was to gather information. Upon returning to the Slytherin common room, Anduin found Rosier and asked him to inform the young pure-blood wizards that they only needed to provide magic books related to blood magic. Each book would deduct 1 month's protection fee, provided Anduin hadn't read that version before. The young wizards who had been extorted were relieved to see that Anduin was reputable and didn't mention the previous attack again. The magic books they had offered were returned, lifting a weight off their shoulders. Initially, some of them, like Yaxley, had considered running away. However, since Anduin didn't press further and the so-called protection fee was merely providing some family books for him to copy, it seemed too easy for those who didn't realize they were undermining their own families. They mocked Anduin for being foolish, thinking he only knew how to extort some useless magic books. By extorting these young wizards, Anduin gained significantly over the next few months. He amassed hundreds of galleons, various magic books, alchemy materials, and more, filling his purse considerably. In terms of spell research, his progress was substantial. After several optimizations, the effect of the incapacity spell improved significantly, and the energy storage spell entered the experimental stage. However, the research on measuring the reserve of magic power was still in the accumulation phase. Many scholars he communicated with provided numerous research ideas, but unfortunately, there was no direct help, not even from Burns. The most critical missing element was live experimental data. He didn't dare to conduct human experiments at school, let alone test on himself. The progress in training was equally gratifying. Since the duel that day, Anduin had conducted a period of high-intensity special training for everyone involved. Every day, he pushed them to their physical and magical limits, leaving everyone exhausted and complaining. Vivian, in particular, was resentful. According to her, she was mentally tortured by Professor Reddy in class and physically tortured by Anduin after class, making her talk less recently. Anduin and Charles were pleased with Vivian's change, as they no longer had to listen to her constant chatter. The high-intensity training had obvious effects. The data collected by Anduin showed that those who underwent special training made visible progress in magic perception, control, and reserve. Compared to previous routine training, the special training made his experimental data more intuitive. Unfortunately, the accuracy of these data remained vague, and quantitative research on magic power had to continue. However, progress had to be made one step at a time. The lack of materials and data hindered the smooth development of the research, and Anduin couldn't continue indefinitely. The third school year was coming to an end. After staying at Hogwarts for so long, Anduin didn't plan to remain at school this summer. He intended to visit some friends and try to collect information on blood magic and alchemy materials. There was one person Anduin had never forgotten: Yaxley. He had forced Yaxley to escape before, preparing for this moment. However, within the British magical world, he still had to be cautious not to let others get a hold of him. So, we have to stage another scene of leading a snake out of its hole. There are so many broken local rules in England, it's quite frustrating, Anduin mused. Anduin took out a strangely shaped compass from his pocket and muttered to himself. Time passed quickly, and the final exams arrived as scheduled. This year, however, was a bit different. While Anduin still passed with all honors, as expected, the real surprise came from Vivienne. After a period of intense training, she managed to achieve an E in most subjects and even got an O in charms. For Vivienne, the end of the semester had always been a stressful and tangled time. In the past, without Anduin's tutoring, she would barely pass, but this year, she excelled, much to the astonishment of Professors Flitwick and McGonagall. They were both surprised, thinking that the once gossipy girl had suddenly become enlightened. "Ha! You should have seen Professor Flitwick's face when I successfully repaired the clock with the repairing charm. It was priceless." Vivienne exclaimed excitedly on the train leaving Hogwarts, showing off to Charles and Velen. Anduin couldn't help but roll his eyes. Vivienne had mentioned this incident for the 8th time. He hadn't expected Professor Flitwick to use the clock he had given him the year before last for the final exam, especially in such a tattered state. Did the professor have a penchant for giving away clocks? That just proves the training program I arranged for you is effective. We'll need to increase the intensity next school year, Anduin said nonchalantly. Vivienne wished she could take back her words. She really didn't want to open that can of worms. Charles, sitting in the carriage, glanced at Vivienne speechlessly before changing the subject. Professor Reddy was hopeless this year. The final exam had us dealing with a boggart. We were supposed to be looking forward to the holidays, not facing something so scary. Anduin nodded, recalling the boggart during the final exam. The memory made his stomach churn. Dealing with a boggart should be a joyful thing, but he managed to make it depressing, Vivienne added, continuing the conversation about their defense against the dark arts class. Thinking of the extremely negative Professor Getty, Anduin wondered if he was cursed after teaching defense against the dark arts for a year. He had heard from the seniors in the Curse Club that this professor's current state was also due to a curse. Charles, noticing Anduin's distraction, interjected, "Anduin, where are you going this summer? Do you want to come to my house for the vacation?" "Forget it," Anduin shook his head. "I promised Mrs. Longbottom that I would stay with her this summer. It's not easy for her to take care of the whole family alone. I need to help." Hearing Anduin mention the Longbottom family, Charles felt a bit downcast. Then, as if remembering something bitter, he said, "The murderer from the Travers family escaped trial by relying on family protection. It's truly despicable." End of this chapter. Chapter 150, The Promise with Neville. Is it the uncle of Temple Travers? Anduin recalled the gloomy face he had seen at the train station. Why didn't the McKinnon family accuse him? He attacked your family twice and once. Vivienne blurted out in a hurry, but suddenly remembered Aunt Charles' accident, so she had to stop abruptly. Isn't it because his elder brother is a member of the Wizengamot Council? That bastard knows how to cover up those criminals, and he got away with the excuse of being under the control of the Imperious Curse. The more Charles thought about it, the angrier he became. All criminals are to be tried by the Wizengamot, and Temple Travers' father was one of the counselors. With his mediation, his Death-Eater brother got away with a small price. "What's his name?" Anduin asked softly, squinting his eyes. "Torquil Travers. It is said that he was named after his ancestor, who once served as the director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." "I bah!" Charles said disdainfully. "I'll remember that," Anduin said softly. Velen glanced at him in surprise, not knowing what Anduin was planning by asking for the name, but he felt something was off. As everyone chatted, time passed quickly, and the train arrived at the station in no time. After getting off the train, Anduin tilted his head and told them, "Remember, you can't slack off on your basic training during the summer vacation. When the next school year starts, I will check your progress. If someone falls behind, don't blame me for being harsh." Several people looked at Anduin and nodded helplessly. Even Velen felt that this year had been more intense than the previous 4 years combined. But when Anduin turned his head and left, the group exchanged knowing glances. The meaning was clear. If they were going to slack off, they would do it together. That way, everyone's level would be about the same, and Anduin wouldn't notice. It was a good team to share both difficulties and blessings. Anduin, who left alone, didn't care about the little schemes in their hearts. He took the night bus again to the village of Ottery St. Catchpole. "Looks like I need to find some time to learn apparition. This bus ride is really annoying." Anduin thought helplessly, feeling the churn in his belly. But thinking of the side effects of learning this magic, he calmed down again. It was too dangerous to learn apparition alone, and he had to practice it with someone's assistance. Withdrawing his thoughts, Anduin appeared at the door of the Longbottom house again, and then heard Augusta's roar from inside. "Neville, how many times have I told you not to put specimens in your mouth? Don't you understand?" Anduin pouted. The old woman's temper was still as fiery as ever. He knocked on the door after a moment's thought. "Oh, Anduin, I haven't seen you for a long time. You've grown taller and more handsome," Augusta said, wearing an apron. She seemed to be in the same condition as before, except for a few more wrinkles on her brows and eyes, and she looked a bit haggard, but she was still very happy to see Anduin. "Hi, Mrs. Longbottom. I'm really sorry that it's been so long since I last visited you. Look at what you said. I know about your situation. The year after the mysterious man disappeared was the most chaotic year. Those desperados were causing trouble everywhere like crazy, even." Augusta seemed to recall some bad memories, her voice gradually weakening. She then shook her head slightly. "Let's not talk about this. Come in quickly." After 2 years, walking into the familiar house again, Anduin still felt a little uncomfortable. The family that used to be happy and lively was now only the old and the young. The 3-year-old little Neville in the living room had just been reprimanded by his grandmother. With tears in his eyes, he was startled when he suddenly saw a stranger walking towards him and couldn't help but... Neville burst into tears. Anduin began to wonder if there was something wrong with him, as little Neville cried every time he saw him. "Don't cry. This is Uncle Wilson. He held you when you were a baby. Don't you remember?" Augusta reprimanded the crying child in a stern tone. Seeing his grandmother angry with him again, little Neville cried even harder, leaving Anduin unsure of what to do. "Mrs. Longbottom, Neville is still young. It's normal for him to be afraid when seeing strangers. Perhaps it's better not to be so strict with him," Anduin suggested gently. "Humph, the boys in the Longbottom family are all men, heroes, and never submissive. I'm doing this for his own good. Anyway, you know this place well, so I won't call you for dinner." "It's ready," Augusta said, giving Neville a serious look before walking quickly into the kitchen. Anduin looked at the now empty living room, then slowly approached little Neville. He took out a handkerchief to wipe away the boy's tears and sighed softly. "Neville, let's get to know each other again. I'm Anduin Wilson. You can call me brother or uncle, whichever you prefer. I'm a friend of your parents," Anduin said in a comforting tone. Perhaps it was Anduin's gentle voice that calmed Neville, or maybe it was because Augusta was no longer staring at him. Neville's crying gradually subsided, and he looked at Anduin with a curious expression. "Are you really friends with my mom and dad? Uncle, do you know where they are?" "I miss them," Neville asked in a childish voice, his eyes wide with hope. Anduin fell silent for a moment, contemplating how to respond. After a while, he picked up Neville, placed him on the sofa, and sat beside him. "Your parents are heroes, Neville. They are very busy, but they will come back to see you soon," Anduin said after some consideration. "But I miss them. Uncle, can you find them for me? Without them, I'm scared alone at night," Neville said, his small eyes wide and pleading. Anduin was momentarily stunned, and then looked at Neville with determination. Okay, I promise you, I will help you find them. Definitely. Then let's make a pinky promise, Neville said with a smile, stretching out his right pinky finger. All right, let's make a pinky promise, Anduin replied, extending his right hand to hook Neville's pinky. Immediately, Neville felt a sense of trust and soon began to play happily in front of Anduin. End of this chapter. Chapter 151. Janice Sitch Ward Augusta, who had just finished preparing dinner, came out and saw Anduin and little Neville getting along so well. She smiled with satisfaction and quickly called them over to eat. After dinner, Anduin played with little Neville for a while. When Neville grew tired, Anduin gently carried him to bed before returning to his own room. In the following days, Anduin settled into a peaceful routine. He helped Augusta with her work every day, played with little Neville, and enjoyed a comfortable life. However, after a few days, Augusta approached him. Tomorrow, I'm going to visit Frank and Alice. You can come with me. You haven't seen them for a long time, Augusta said. Yes, Anduin replied. He had been wanting to suggest visiting Frank and Alice since he moved in, but he was sensitive to Augusta's feelings. Now that she brought it up, he readily agreed. Then Anduin thought of something and asked, What about Neville? Should we bring him along? Will it be too much for him? Augusta understood his concern and explained, My nephew, Algis, will come over tomorrow. He is Frank's cousin and Neville's uncle. He will take care of Neville for us. It's too early for Neville to understand this. Seeing that Augusta had already made arrangements, Anduin nodded in relief. The next day, after Augusta and Anduin packed their bags, they arrived at St. Mungo's Hospital for magical injuries and sickness. The Longbottoms were placed in the Janice Sitch ward on the 5th floor of the hospital. The ward was named in honor of Janice Sitch, who faked his own death in 1973 by pretending he was eaten by a Voldabat. Only patients whose brains had been permanently damaged by spells were placed here. This ward was a closed ward, and the door was usually locked. Today was no exception. Augusta found the therapist in charge of the ward, Miriam Straw, and asked her to open the door for them. Frank and Alice have been emotionally stable recently and are very well behaved, Straw said as she opened the door. Anduin found her choice of words peculiar, but it wasn't until he saw Frank and Alice that he understood why she described them that way. Frank and Alice looked very different from before, with strands of white hair appearing on their heads and their eyes dull, lacking the energy they once had. Sugar? I want some candy, Frank said, stretching out his hand. Okay, good boy. I'll treat you to a sizzling honey bee candy today, Straw said, skillfully taking out a few candies from her jacket pocket and coaxing Frank. Alice glanced at the crowd, then turned her head to look out the window, counting the passers-by. After being soothed by the therapist like a child, Frank finally calmed down. Straw nodded to Augusta and Anduin before leaving the ward. Augusta glanced at Anduin, nodded at him, then skillfully stepped forward and took Frank's hand. She spoke to him gently, telling him to eat less sugar, and checked his bed sheets and clothes, even though the nurses took good care of their daily necessities. As a mother, she still checked them over and over again habitually. Anduin also approached Frank and Alice, speaking a few words to them, but neither responded. Frank was like a child who only wanted candy, while Alice stared blankly out of the window. Mrs. Longbottom, there is something I would like to ask for your permission, Anduin hesitated, then said to Augusta. Why are you being polite to me? Just tell me if you have something to say, Augusta replied while combing Alice's hair. I want to check their memory. I know it may be difficult, but I still want to see if I can help them, Anduin said. Augusta sighed. I appreciate your kindness, but when they first had the accident, Dumbledore himself checked them, and even he couldn't do anything about it, so I don't. You think it's a waste of time, Augusta said, her voice tinged with skepticism. I know my abilities are limited right now, Anduin replied, his tone resolute. But I'm still young. Just because I can't do some things now doesn't mean, and I won't be able to in the future. And, he paused, taking a deep breath. I promised Neville that I would bring his parents back for him. Seeing the determination in Anduin's eyes, Augusta fell into deep thought. After a moment, she nodded. Perhaps this young man would find a way. Maybe deep down she also harbored a sliver of hope. With Augusta's permission, Anduin approached Frank. "Frank, I'm Anduin. What I'm about to do might be a bit intrusive," he said gently. He placed his hands on Frank's slightly bewildered face and activated legilimency. Anduin was meticulous, ensuring his thoughts did not rush violently into Frank's mind. Instead, he delved slowly, exploring Frank's thoughts with care. In his unique magical perspective, memories appeared as individual or series of memory bubbles, floating like fragments in a shattered ruin. Frank's mind was a fragmented landscape, with occasional memory fragments drifting into view, but none forming a complete picture. As Anduin continued, his expression grew increasingly serious. The fundamental issue was not just the fragmentation or chaos of Frank's memories. If that were the case, Anduin could piece them together with time. The strangest aspect was the sheer scarcity of memories in Frank's mind. A normal person's thinking space resembled a village, with varying numbers of houses. Even if the village were destroyed, remnants would remain. But in Frank's mind, the ruins were sparse, almost non-existent. It seems the problem runs deeper, Anduin thought, his concern mounting. He controlled his magical vision to probe deeper into Frank's thinking space. As he ventured further, the frequency of memory fragments increased. In this directionless mental landscape, the fragments acted like lighthouses, guiding him towards areas with more memories. After a prolonged exploration, Anduin finally discovered the root of the problem. However, the sight that greeted him in his magical vision was nothing short of shocking. End of this chapter. Chapter 152, Resolved. In his field of vision, there was a huge mountain with an exaggerated shape. A mountain composed of memory bubbles and fragments squeezed, piled up, and gathered together. Anduin looked at this towering memory mountain in the magical field of vision, certain that almost all the memories in Frank's thinking space were accumulated here, whether from the past or present. How could this be? Anduin wondered aloud, concentrating on observing this peculiar scene, trying to find some clues. He soon discovered something special. There seemed to be something hidden within this memory mountain. If observed quietly, a faint green glow could be seen flashing through the memory bubbles. After pondering for a while, he decided to give it a try. Carefully, he stretched out his mental tentacles and gently touched the mountain peak. Suddenly, Frank's usually confused expression turned ferocious, and he began to struggle violently. Noticing Frank's sudden change, Anduin quickly withdrew his mental tentacles and ended the legilimency. What happened? Augusta, who had also noticed Frank's change, hurried over to check his state. But since Anduin had already withdrawn his mental tentacles, Frank returned to his confused state. After a careful examination, Augusta didn't notice anything unusual about Frank, but she had seen the strange change in her son. She looked at Anduin with questioning eyes. Anduin, afraid of causing Frank further injury, had explored his mind very slowly and cautiously. Exhausted and sweating profusely, he took a breath and said to Augusta, "Frank's situation is a bit special." "Oh, did you find the cause of the problem?" Augusta asked quickly. "I seem to have found it, but not completely," Anduin replied carefully, clearly conflicted. "What does that mean?" Augusta frowned, not understanding Anduin's words. Anduin thought for a moment under Augusta's gaze, and then replied, "Their memories, probably because they were affected by the Cruciatus curse, are almost all huddled together and glued in a deformed way. To restore their memories, we need to find a way to break this bonded state, but I haven't figured out how to do that yet." After listening to Anduin's words, Augusta stood up and paced for a while. Then, tilting her head, she asked, "Does that mean that as long as we find a way to release their special memory state, we can restore their memory?" "In theory, yes, but the operation is very difficult," Anduin replied. "Why is that?" Augusta asked. "Memory is not like bricks. After building a wall, you can't just turn it back into bricks by cutting it. Memory fragments are very fragile. If manipulated indiscriminately, they could cause secondary damage," Anduin sighed. This state was too rare. Anduin had read many books related to memory magic, but had never found any similar records. Starting from scratch without similar material to experiment with was risky. Using Frank and Alice as experiments could be disastrous if something went wrong. Augusta also sighed. "I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Maybe this is their fate. Thank you, Anduin. I appreciate your kindness. I already have enough capacity. Even if they can't recover in their lifetime, as long as I can see them often, I will be very happy. You don't have to be so pessimistic, Anduin frowned. I'll figure out a way. Although I don't have a solution now, knowing the cause at least gives us hope. Augusta thought Anduin was merely comforting her. She forced a smile and nodded. Okay, let's stop here for today. It's time for us to go back. The two walked out of St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries with heavy hearts. A few days passed after returning to the Longbottoms. During this time, Anduin had been searching for a lot of relevant information, but he was still at a loss. It seemed that he would not be able to find a solution for a while. It looks like I need to find a way to expand my information reserves and maybe get rid of that guy in the process, Anduin thought. The next day, Anduin proposed to Augusta that he would go to Diagon Alley and return by himself later. He then took Muggle transportation to the Leaky Cauldron. Walking into the Leaky Cauldron, he saw Tom, who hadn't changed in the 3 years since Anduin last saw him. Tom was still wiping glasses behind the bar alone. However, the bar itself was a bit different from the last time Anduin visited. There were already customers inside, and quite a few of them. As he passed by several tables, he noticed some guests with fried chicken on their plates. It seemed that the recipe he had left for Tom was quite popular. "Boss, I'll have a butterbeer," Anduin called out. Tom, who was concentrating on wiping his wine glass, heard the somewhat familiar voice. He looked up and laughed loudly. "Ha-ha, Anduin, you still remember to come back and see me, you heartless guy. We haven't seen each other in 3 years. Yeah, I've been troubled by some chores before, and this is the first time I've been back to Diagon Alley in so many years. Your business seems to be doing well," Anduin replied with a slight smile. "It's all thanks to you. The menu you gave me is very popular. Maybe you should consider opening your own bar in the future," Tom said, clearly happy to see Anduin again. He poured a large glass of butterbeer and pushed it in front of him. The two long-lost friends quickly fell into conversation, with endless topics to discuss. Anduin learned about the changes in the Leaky Cauldron and Diagon Alley over the past 2 years. Since the disappearance of the mysterious man, wizards who had been hiding came out to party and celebrate. During that time, Tom's business was booming, and the bar was almost always full of people. However, after a while, some unmanaged Death Eaters began causing trouble. Many of those guys were lunatics, and being wanted and hunted down only made them act more recklessly, causing a lot of damage. Diagon Alley was even under martial law for a period. However, under the leadership of Millicent Barnold, the Ministry of Magic was extremely efficient. Frequent arrests led to the capture of some Death Eaters, quickly suppressing the riots. The remaining Death Eaters either fled, went into hiding, or had connections that helped them evade punishment. About half a year ago, Diagon Alley returned to calm, and the situation was similar throughout the magical world. End of this chapter. Chapter 153, Tracking. Do you know if there have been any suspicious individuals in Diagon Alley or Nocturne Alley recently? Specifically, dark wizards? Anduin asked Tom. Dark wizards? Tom glanced at Anduin, puzzled by his interest in such matters. Nevertheless, he answered truthfully, Diagon Alley is currently plastered with arrest warrants for Death Eaters. Those dark wizards are too busy hiding to come here. As for Nocturne Alley, I don't know much. The situation there is complicated, and most wizards who go there don't pass by me. They usually use Borgin and Burke's fireplace. Anduin nodded, smiling. I see. I was just curious. Thanks for the chat, Tom. I need to do some shopping in Diagon Alley, but let's catch up properly when I have more time. With that, Anduin walked through the bar hall and headed to the backyard patio. Tom watched him leave, noting how much the young wizard had changed over the past 2 years. Something about their conversation felt off, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. After passing through the courtyard, Anduin skillfully opened the stone gate to Diagon Alley. The streets were bustling, a stark contrast to the deserted scene 3 years ago. People thronged the alleys, and many wizards had set up temporary stalls on both sides of the street, creating a vibrant commercial atmosphere. It seems the wizarding world thrives in peacetime, Anduin observed with interest. He then walked to the side of the road and took out a compass-shaped device from his pocket to check something. If my calculations are correct, Yaxley should be hiding in Diagon Alley. For him to remain hidden here, he must either be protected by his family or other Death Eaters. Either way, this will be a fruitful endeavor, Anduin muttered with a sneer. During the pre-Christmas fight, Anduin had secretly implanted a newly developed soft, needle-like magical tracker in Yaxley's shoes, clothes, belt, and even his underwear. This tracker was linked to the compass-like tracking disc in his hand. The disc had several pointers, each indicating the location of a tracker and the approximate distance. All the pointers now converged in the same direction, confirming Yaxley's location. Anduin moved to a deserted alley, donned a dark cloak to conceal his face, and followed the direction indicated by the tracking disc. He navigated through the streets of Diagon Alley, past Gringotts, and finally arrived at his destination on the north side of Diagon Alley. The building was a simple 3-story stone structure, separated from its neighbors by a narrow 1-meter-wide path. The first floor had no storefront or company sign, making it look more like a private residence than a commercial building. Despite its prime location in Diagon Alley, it didn't seem to be a business establishment, which was unusual given the high rents in the area. Could this be private property belonging to a family? Anduin wondered. Standing opposite the building, he saw that the pointer on his tracking disc pointed directly at it. As he moved to the small alley beside the house, the pointer adjusted its direction accordingly, still indicating the building. This must be the place, Anduin concluded. However, the door was closed, and he couldn't risk entering without more information. He decided to gather some intel first. After selecting a few vantage points around the house, Anduin began his surveillance. The surroundings were bustling. On both sides of the house were various shops. Opposite was the Flue Palm Company, known for producing flue powder. The gate to Flue Palm was closed, and next to it, in the direction of the Leaky Cauldron, stood Gringotts. On the other side was the Diagon Alley Cafe. Through the cafe's window, Anduin spotted an acquaintance, Emmeline Vance. She was sitting by the window, sipping coffee leisurely, but her eyes occasionally glanced sideways towards Yaxley's house, which was tucked away opposite. Oh, the Aurors or the Order of the Phoenix have noticed this place too. It seems my hunch was correct that day. Dumbledore has also set his sights on Yaxley. Could it be that he wants to follow the clues? Anduin thought, pulling his cloak tighter to hide his face. But why don't these Aurors just break down the door and arrest him? Is there something special about the owner of this house? He pondered. Realizing he needed more information, he decided to start with the building adjoining Yaxley's house. He didn't want to expose himself to Emmeline in the coffee shop, so he turned his attention to Lady Primpnell's beauty pharmacy. With a determined mind, Anduin pushed open the door of the beauty pharmacy. Miss Purnell had been in a good mood recently. Since the lifting of martial law in Diagon Alley, business had returned to normal levels, and the number of customers had even increased. She was tending the counter when she heard the bell ring at the door. Overjoyed at the prospect of another customer, she turned around, only to see a wizard tightly covered with a cloak. This wasn't surprising. Many witches who drank potions at home often made a mess of their faces. As her signboard indicated, helping witches solve their beauty troubles was her specialty. Welcome, dear lady. You seem to need the help of beauty potions. Please don't be shy. No matter how terrible your face is, you can solve your troubles here. Miss Purnell began her standard speech, but stopped mid-sentence when the person pulled down the cloak, revealing a young, handsome boy. This is a man? Or is it a lady with a tougher appearance? Or perhaps someone who drank the wrong potion and turned themselves into this? Miss Purnell wondered. She had seen all sorts of transformations, even a witch who had turned herself into a cat-faced creature. Just as she was contemplating how to address this guest, he spoke first. Hello, I'm here to pick out gifts for the elders in my family. Do you have any recommendations? Anduin asked, noticing the boss's dazed expression. End of this chapter. Chapter 154, The Flying Crow Technique. Miss Purnell responded quickly, greeting Anduin with a warm smile. So that's the case. I was just wondering why I haven't seen such a handsome young wizard before. What kind of potion do you want to prepare for your family? Is it to eliminate those small troubles on the face, remove wrinkles, or simply enhance beauty? Listening to Miss Purnell's flattery, Anduin initially showed no expression. However, after a moment's thought, he decided to respond. He forced a smile and said, "My aunt is getting older and has many worries every day. She has been looking a bit haggard recently. Do you have any suitable medicine to recommend?" Before he finished speaking, Miss Purnell eagerly took over the conversation. "Well, then I recommend our shop's secret Prime Refreshing Potion. Apply it once in the morning and evening. It tightens the skin, delays aging, and improves complexion. This is our flagship product." As she spoke, Miss Purnell led Anduin to a display case, took out a beautifully packaged potion bottle, and demonstrated its use by applying some on the back of her hand. The effect was immediate. The treated area became noticeably smoother and firmer. Anduin took the potion bottle, brought it to his nose, and sniffed it. He frowned slightly. This seemed to be a diluted beauty potion. He had made some in the past to earn extra money, so he was somewhat familiar with its properties. The formula was uncommon and a bit troublesome to prepare, but the materials were inexpensive. However, the production cycle was long, and it wasn't very profitable, which is why he didn't make it often. He glanced at the price tag. 2 galleons per bottle. At least half of it was diluted. How could they charge so much? Women's money was indeed easy to earn. But considering he was here to gather information, Anduin nodded with a smile. "Yes, I'll take a bottle. Please pack it for me." Seeing the young wizard in front of her so pleased, Miss Purnell's mood improved, and she swiftly packed the potion for him. At this moment, Anduin casually asked, "By the way, do you know who owns the house next door? Our family is considering opening a store in Diagon Alley, and the location next door isn't bad. It doesn't seem to be doing any business." "Oh, opening a store? What kind of store is your family planning to open?" Miss Purnell asked with some caution. She didn't doubt the young wizard's identity, but was concerned about potential competition. "We're planning to open an alchemy props store. There's only one boutique in Diagon Alley that specializes in Quidditch supplies, and there aren't many alchemy supply stores," Anduin explained, noticing her concern. "I see," Miss Purnell sighed in relief. "If you're interested in the shop next door, it might be a bit troublesome to rent it." "Oh, why is that?" "It's been a long time since there was a merchant in that house, and almost no one knows who the property belongs to. The owner is quite mysterious." Miss Purnell paused, recalling something. "But some time ago, I occasionally saw Julia Malfoy coming in and out of the place. Oh no, it should be Julia Travers now. I always forget she married into the Travers family. Maybe you can ask the Travers family." "Travers?" Hearing this name, Anduin's mind cleared. It seemed that fate had a way of bringing certain people together. He silently cursed his luck. Miss Purnell noticed Anduin deep in thought and continued, "I advise you to be cautious when dealing with the Travers family. They have a reputation for being difficult. You shouldn't open an alchemy shop. Those long-winded alchemy items aren't very popular in the UK, and they're difficult to repair once broken. Aren't those gadgets all Egyptian specialties? There used to be an alchemy shop in Diagon Alley, but it went bankrupt quickly because the products weren't popular at all. If your family is really interested, you might as well open a bar. Tom's place at the entrance is always full of people, and the bar business must be good." Ignoring Miss Purnell's nagging jeer, Anduin paid the money with a smile, put away the potion, and walked out of the shop without looking back, despite the witch owner's gracious greeting. After leaving the shop, Anduin immediately put on his cloak and examined the poor-quality potion in his hand. "This bottle is really pretty," he thought. "I shouldn't throw it away. When I get back, I'll pour out the potion and use the bottle to hold other potions." After collecting his things, Anduin went to the Owl post office and sent an express letter to Augusta, informing her that he would stay at the Leaky Cauldron for one night to catch up with the owner, Tom. He told her not to wait for him and to have Tainwind write back to him. After finishing all this, Anduin put on his cloak again and squatted in a narrow alley opposite the house. If there's no accident, the Tefras family is protecting Yaxley. The question now is how to catch them all. The Aurors of the Ministry of Magic are hindered by procedural justice or are members of the Tefras Patriarch Council. They surely won't break into the house and search it, Anduin thought, as he looked at the quiet house that seemed to be empty. Besides, there are very likely traps or warning devices set up here. There must also be a fireplace in the house. Rushing in may alarm them, and there's a high probability that these guys will escape via the Flu Network or apparition. This might be another reason why the Aurors and the Phoenix Department haven't tried it. If they rush in and find no one there, it would be easy to fall into a passive political position. And this is Diagon Alley. If a battle breaks out, it could easily cause accidental injuries. I need to figure out what's going on inside before I can act. First of all, I need to carry out some investigation work, Anduin thought. He gently lifted a corner of his cloak, and a dark-colored raven flew out, heading straight for the house. It's not that the blood magic has been fruitless after studying it for so long. At least the shared field of view technology of the flying birds has been developed in time. Unfortunately, the current operating range is only about 100 meters, so it can barely be used. Anduin mused as he closed one eye lightly, and the vision of the raven emerged in his mind. The little raven flew out, crossed the alley in Diagon Alley, and flew over the house. It circled a few times before landing on a windowsill on the 3rd floor. Chapter 155, Investigation. The scene in the room unfolded before Anduin's eyes. Inside the window was an empty bedroom, neatly decorated, indicating it was inhabited. The little raven continued its investigation along the window sills of the entire 3rd floor, checking each room one by one. The entire 3rd floor was devoid of people, consisting solely of bedrooms. However, traces of human presence were evident, suggesting multiple occupants. Seeing no valuable information on the 3rd floor, Anduin directed the little raven to the windowsill on the 2nd floor. This window faced a hall where several people were chatting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 people in total. Yaxley is indeed inside, and one of them is Torquil Travers, whom I saw at the station and in Sample's memory before. His uncle and 3 others must be Death Eaters too, Anduin noted. The little raven continued to survey the entire 2nd floor, but found no additional people. It seemed only these individuals were currently residing in the house, matching the information gathered from the 3rd floor bedrooms. Next, I need to figure out the security configuration of this house. Time to test my duel skills, Anduin thought. He lifted his cloak, revealing another little raven at his feet. With a mental command, he directed the first little raven to fly back into the sky, circling briefly before landing on the house's chimney. All the doors and windows were tightly closed, suggesting the chimney might be the only entry point. The original little raven remained on the 2nd floor windowsill, monitoring the people inside. The 2nd raven, without hesitation, entered the chimney. Anduin knew from his outdoor investigation that each floor of the house had a fireplace. The 2nd raven first appeared at the 3rd floor fireplace under Anduin's control. From the 2nd raven's perspective, the Death Eaters showed no reaction. Good. It seems there's no warning magic installed in the chimney. Let's figure out the situation on the 3rd floor first, Anduin thought. The 2nd raven peeked out from the fireplace and looked around, then began exploring the 3rd floor. The small building was quite spacious. The 3rd floor consisted of a small living room and 6 rooms, one of which was a bathroom, leaving 5 bedrooms. In the small living room, there were 2 pairs of sofas facing each other, a wooden coffee table in the middle, various cabinets of different heights, and a clock. After circling the living room several times, the 2nd raven did not trigger any alarms. Through the raven's vision, Anduin saw no signs of warning magic in the room. It seems there is no warning magic on the floor. If there were, they wouldn't be able to walk around without triggering it themselves, Anduin mused. Leaving the center of the living room, the 2nd raven began searching along the corners and walls. Anduin refrained from having the raven touch the walls, recalling various protective spells he had seen with Lily. Many warning spells were triggered by contact. Along the corner, the 2nd raven reached the window and carefully examined it. Soon, it noticed faint runes occasionally appearing on the inner windowsill, a common occurrence on temporarily enchanted items. If the item were of good material and the spell inscribed with a dark engraving method, such an obvious overflow of magic power would not occur. It seems there is indeed warning magic on the window, but I don't know if there is any on the walls, Anduin concluded. Don't worry about it. Let's check the bedroom first, Anduin thought as he controlled the raven. Guiding Raven number 1 to the doors of several bedrooms, he noticed that all the doors were made of dark wood, giving them an old-fashioned appearance. Upon closer inspection, he realized that the doors were enchanted, just like the other rooms. So, there are warning spells on all the doors and windows. Sneaking in through these places seems impossible. If only I knew how to apparate, this wouldn't be such a hassle. What should I do? Anduin pondered for a moment before his eyes lit up with an idea. Yes, I can poison them first and then come in after they've been knocked out. With a plan in mind, Anduin directed Raven number 1 to search for food and water sources. However, after a thorough search, he found no food stored on this floor, and the bathroom door was also enchanted. He decided to go downstairs to investigate further. Earlier, when Raven number 1 was scouting outside, it had discovered that the kitchen was on the second floor. The layout of the house seemed designed for commercial purposes. The first floor was mostly empty. The second floor housed the kitchen, bathroom, and living room, and the third floor was primarily bedrooms. Raven number 1 cautiously approached the stairs, wary of making any noise that might alert the occupants. After confirming that the stairs were not enchanted, it began its descent. Although the raven was agile in flight, controlling it to walk down the stairs quietly was challenging. The staircase had a 180-degree turn in the middle, and after navigating the first flight, Raven number 1 reached the corner. Peeking around the corner, the raven quickly retracted its head. It had seen that the stairs led directly to the living room, where the backs of several Death Eaters were visible. An open kitchen was adjacent to the living room. More importantly, there was a looking glass hanging above the living room, a high-end product judging by its size. Fortunately, the looking glass did not trigger an alarm. The Death Eaters were engrossed in conversation and did not notice the raven. Raven number 1 peeked again to confirm that the looking glass remained inactive. It seems that the shared field of view doesn't trigger the looking glass's alarm. It's a pity that the current Flying Crow art only allows for poor quality vision sharing and doesn't transmit sound. Otherwise, I could eavesdrop on their conversation. Realizing that the kitchen's location was too conspicuous, Anduin decided to abandon the poisoning plan. It's too risky. Better to return to the third floor and think of another way, he thought, frowning slightly. Back on the third floor, Raven number 1 paced back and forth, examining the windows and bedroom doors, contemplating various possibilities. End of this chapter. Chapter 156. The Conversation. It was unfortunate that the little raven's vision sharing didn't allow Anduin to see things as clearly as if he were there himself. In modern terms, the resolution wasn't high enough, making it impossible for him to recognize the enchanted runes in the house with the naked eye. The little raven couldn't cast spells either, so there was no way to break these warning spells from the inside. It seems that sneaking in is not an option. Do we really need to attack by force or lure them out? Anduin pondered aloud. Suddenly, something caught his attention. He manipulated Raven number 1 to stand in front of a bedroom door, staring at the crack. This door appears to be the standard size of 80 centimeters by 2 meters, but the gap is much larger than normal, at least 1.5 centimeters wide. If that's the case, there might be a way, Anduin said, his eyes lighting up as an idea formed in his mind. Let's test if there's any defensive magic on the wall, Anduin thought. He directed Raven number 1 to pace to the side of a wall and peck lightly with its beak. Nothing happened. The raven continued pecking along the wall until it reached the outer wall with windows, where it finally triggered a reaction. Through the raven's vision, Anduin saw the faces of the people on the second floor change rapidly, as if they had noticed something. In the living room on the second floor, Torquil Travers, who was talking with 4 others, quickly drew his wand. The others reacted just as swiftly, drawing their wands and standing on guard. The alarm on the third floor has been triggered. Karkaroff, go up and check it out. The rest of you, stay alert, Torquil instructed a bearded man. Me again? Igor Karkaroff muttered reluctantly, but he had no choice. He had been seeking asylum with Travers during his exile. With his wand tightly in hand, Karkaroff slowly walked upstairs. On the second floor, Tokyo looked at the remaining people with a grim expression. Yaxley, Goyle, and Crab, each of you grab a handful of flu powder. If things go wrong, transfer to Traverse Manor immediately. The other three nodded, and each grabbed a handful of powder, ready to use it at any moment. Karkaroff, now upstairs, looked around carefully, but found no one. He meticulously checked every location, including each bedroom, but found nothing. Just as he was feeling puzzled, a knocking sound echoed, and he sensed the warning magic again. Karkaroff quickly pointed his wand at the source of the sound, only to find a little crow foolishly pecking at the glass by the windowsill. Huh! Karkaroff sighed in relief. So it was you, little guy, scaring everyone. He walked to the window, pointed his wand at it, muttered a spell, then opened the window and waved the little crow away. He carefully glanced outside at Diagon Alley, found everything normal, closed the window, recast the spell, and returned to the second floor. Seeing Karkaroff return with a relaxed expression, Tokyo asked cautiously, "What happened?" "A silly crow hit the window. It must have triggered the alarm. I've chased it away and checked everything. No one came in," Karkaroff replied, sitting back on the sofa with a grin. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, put down the flu powder, and sat down. Karkaroff, noticing that they were all ready to flee at any moment, felt a pang of discomfort. "So, I'm just a burden to be discarded at any time in your eyes," he thought bitterly. He curled his lips in slight dissatisfaction, but didn't say much. Tokyo noticed Karkaroff's expression and knew he was displeased, but he didn't care. He continued to focus on the ongoing discussion. "Let's stay here for a while. My brother is under a lot of pressure right now. Millicent Barnold is trying to win over those families that are undecided. If things go south, we can flee abroad together and wait for the Dark Lord's call," Tokyo suggested. "But I'm still a bit reluctant. My child with Goyle has just turned 3 years old," the chubby Crab hesitated. "Yeah, let's ask your brother to help contact some Peeth, your blood families, to support us. Haven't you noticed that many people have escaped the hunt, like you and Malfoy? Why can you act as if nothing happened while we have to?" The robust Goyle was interrupted by Tokyo before he could finish. "That's enough. Didn't I tell you that Millicent is crazy? She wants to clean up, and she has Dumbledore backing her. Do you think my situation is easy now? They might even bring up the McKinnon family again and blame me." Tokyo yelled angrily. He then took a deep breath to calm himself. "I understand your difficulties, but the situation is dire. I've already contacted Yulia, and she has spoken to Lucius Malfoy. He will help take care of your wives and children. When the Dark Lord returns, we can regain everything we've lost. However, many people say that the Dark Lord is already dead. Maybe we just need to tell the Ministry of Magic that we were controlled by the Imperious Curse and were forced to." Karkaroff, tall and thick, spoke timidly before Tokyo shot him a sharp look. Enraged by Karkaroff's words, Tokyo stood up, grabbed Karkaroff by the neck, and stared at him fiercely. "The Dark Lord is immortal. Are you trying to betray us?" he shouted. "No, that's not what I mean. I mean we should pretend," Karkaroff quickly explained, startled by Tokyo's reaction. "Humph, do you think they are fools? You've been wanted and on the run, and you're still daydreaming. Even I, who was released on bail, have to avoid those guys now. Why would they exonerate you?" Tokyo sneered, then turned to Yaxley. "What's the matter? You've been silent since the beginning. What are you thinking?" "Me?" Yaxley was jolted from his daze by Tokyo's question. "It's nothing. It's just that when Karkaroff mentioned the crow earlier, it reminded me of someone, a damned little wizard." Anduin Wilson? Tokyo actually knew the name. T.I. lost again, the classic runner-up. It's really frustrating to watch. When will C and Dota stand up? End of this chapter. Chapter 157, Preparing for Action. "That's right. It was that nasty mudblood that caused me to be like this. I'm really not reconciled to letting him get away like this." Yaxley recalled some painful memories, his eyes red with anger. "Oh, Sampel just mentioned that guy to me 2 days ago. He dared to beat and insult my nephew and trample on our noble honor. I won't let him go," Tokyo sneered viciously. "Huh? What do you mean?" Yaxley looked up at Tokyo, curiosity piqued. I've already asked someone to investigate thoroughly. That little bastard is now living with the Longbottom family. Before you leave the UK, we can get rid of him and the old stubborn Longbottoms. Then you'll have your chance for revenge, Tokyo said, patting Yaxley on the shoulder. Really? But how will you manage to escape the crime? Yaxley asked, still haunted by the torture he endured at Anduin's hands. The stinging pain that penetrated his bone marrow was unforgettable, often waking him up in nightmares. It's simple. We leave no one alive. It's just a group of old and weak women and children. If it comes to it, I'll leave with you. But before we go, we need to make a big fuss to show them the consequences of confronting us, Tokyo said, taking a deep breath. He looked at Yaxley again. After we've dealt with them, we'll go to Europe to join your brother and the Caro siblings. Even if we leave the UK, we can still make a name for ourselves. Okay. Yaxley's expression gradually became ferocious and crazed, responding with hatred. Gore and Crab exchanged glances, realizing there was no other option. Since Tokyo had already planned their escape, they nodded in agreement. Only Karkaroff remained with a bitter expression. He had hoped to find refuge with the Dark Lord, but now he was a wanted criminal, still under Tokyo's command, and could only obediently follow orders. Meanwhile, Anduin had already put on his cloak and left the area. After Raven 2 triggered the alarm on the outer wall, he quickly hid in the fireplace and directed Ravenforce to cover the third-floor window, avoiding detection. From the information he gathered, all the outer walls, windows, and doors of the house were protected by warning and protective spells, making them difficult to breach from the outside. There was also a looking glass on the second floor, likely where the looking glass would be transferred. Breaking in or sneaking through would be challenging, but the inner wall and fireplace were not equipped with warning magic, making them the best points of entry. Anduin sketched a three-dimensional model of the house in his mind, assessing the feasibility of his plan. Confident in the high success rate, he moved to the preparation stage. He didn't linger around the house, but hurried back to the Leaky Cauldron. He booked a room with Tom, saying he would stay for the night, which made Tom very happy. He even waived Anduin's room fee. At this time, Shunfeng arrived, indicating that Augusta had received his message. With the owl in tow, Anduin went upstairs to his room. After placing Shunfeng on the owl stand, he scratched its head and said softly, "Wait here obediently for me to come back. I'll treat you to a good meal later. There's a lot to do, so don't fail me at critical times." After calming Shunfeng, he added some water and nuts for it. Then, Anduin cast a disillusionment charm on himself, pushed open the window and climbed out. Leaving the Leaky Cauldron, Anduin took out a map of London and began searching for something specific. After a while, Anduin seemed to have found his target and ran straight in a certain direction. If you could identify it from the map, the place Anduin headed to was a small local warehouse that stored medical equipment and chemical materials. Meanwhile, Shunfeng dozed obediently in the room. 2 hours later, as the sky darkened, it was awakened by the sound of the room's windows being reopened. That guy would just keep fooling around. It also reappeared as the master of the coolies. Phew, hurry up and get everything together. Let's go, Shunfeng. Let's go downstairs to eat some delicious food. With a chubby owl on his arm, Anduin walked downstairs as if nothing had happened. He cooked a large table of dishes for himself, Tom, and Shunfeng, and then enjoyed dinner with Tom. At this time, there were still many customers in the bar, and when they smelled the fragrance from Anduin's table, they frequently looked over. Boss Tom chatted with Anduin and tasted the delicious food. Their meal didn't end until after 9 o'clock in the evening. Afterward, Anduin led his owl back to the room. Once back in the room, Anduin acted quickly. First, he went to the desk, took out parchment, and wrote a few letters. Then he approached Shunfeng and said, "Shunfeng, your mission tonight is very important. I will tie a messenger claw ring on you later. Pay attention to the message I send you, just like we practiced in the hut in the Forbidden Forest, understand?" It was the first time Shunfeng saw his master looking at him with such a solemn expression, and he nodded seriously. "Very well. Take care of these 2 letters. If I send you a signal tonight, it means the operation is not going well and needs support. You should immediately send these 2 letters to Moody and Dumbledore of the Ministry of Magic. Anduin took out 2 white envelopes and gestured to Xunfeng. Then he took out 2 brown envelopes and explained, "If you receive 2 signals, it means everything is going well. One of these 2 letters will be handed over to Moody at the Ministry of Magic at 6 o'clock tomorrow, and the other will be delivered to Rita Skeeter of the Daily Prophet around 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Make sure she receives it personally." Xunfeng tilted his head, as if seriously confirming Anduin's order, and then nodded again. "Finally, if you receive 3 signals, it means the operation cannot continue, but the enemy has not found me. In that case, you don't have to do anything. However, no matter what signal I give you in the end, you must send it to Augustana after noon tomorrow. After that, you don't have to come back. Just wait for me at Longbottom's house." Anduin was cautious and explained the functions of the letters to Xunfeng several times to ensure understanding. Chapter 158. Multi-line operations. After confirming that Xunfeng fully understood, Anduin sorted the letters and placed them on the desk. He then cast the disillusionment charm on himself once more, slipped out the window, and disappeared into the night. Perhaps because the magical world had just returned to peace, Diagon Alley was quite serene at night. Apart from the occasional wizard strolling through the alley, there were no other figures in sight. Most of the shops on both sides of the street had closed early for the night. Anduin, now invisible, floated quietly a foot above the ground, heading towards the house where the 5 Death Eaters were hiding. The house was closed, and Emmeline Vance, who had been monitoring the place, was nowhere to be seen. Unsure whether the Aurors had left or were still hiding nearby, Anduin carefully circled the house, searching for any signs of surveillance. After ruling out several potential hiding spots, he finally relaxed. Ensuring that no one was around to disturb him, Anduin summoned a raven, just as he had done in the morning. The raven flew to the windowsill on the 3rd floor of the house to observe. Of the 5 guest rooms, 4 had their curtains drawn and oil lamps turned off, making it impossible to see inside. The one room with undrawn curtains was dimly lit. Inside, Yaxley sat at his desk by the light of an oil lamp, folding a letter and stuffing it into an envelope. After finishing his task, Yaxley stretched tiredly, took off his coat and shoes, turned off the oil lamp, and went to bed without changing his clothes. Before lying down, he used his wand to draw the curtains. Judging by Yaxley's state, they must be sleeping fully armed, ready to flee at a moment's notice. They are well prepared, Anduin thought, nodding thoughtfully. He then cast the disillusionment charm on himself again, and waited quietly in the narrow alley next to the house. In the silence of the night, Anduin waited for another half-hour, ensuring that the Death Eaters were asleep. He then used the extraordinary levitation technique to slowly fly to the roof of the house and land. Summoning another raven, he sent it down the chimney to check the situation inside. Raven number 1 remained on guard at the windowsill outside, ready to alert Anduin to any changes. Raven number 2, which had entered the 3rd floor, observed that the looking glass seen in the morning had been moved to the 3rd floor. However, it did not react to the little raven in its shared vision state. Raven number 2 walked around the 3rd floor, but did not trigger any alarms. After confirming the safety, Anduin controlled it to return to the roof. Very well. It seems the alert mode at night hasn't changed. It's time to test my operational abilities, Anduin muttered, taking a deep breath. He then began to carefully take items out of the interspatial bag he carried. First, he retrieved a large metal bottle resembling an oxygen tank used in medicine. Next, he pulled out a large bundle of plastic hoses of various types. Using a spell, he controlled these items to float quietly in the air and began the splicing work. He first attached a thicker industrial plastic hose to the gas cylinder, then installed a diverter on the other end, and slowly extended the rubber hose down the chimney. Next, Anduin summoned several ravens, each carrying or holding a few bundles of thin tubes. These ravens flew into the 3rd floor through the chimney. Once inside, they became busy, distributing the thin tubes throughout the room. Ravens adjusted the position of the thick tube and slowly pulled it out of the fireplace, while others installed the thin tube and the diverter together. Since the hoses were connected by metal nuts, the little ravens had to use their beaks to tighten these nuts one by one. After this operation, Anduin was already sweating profusely from exhaustion. He had to control several ravens simultaneously, ensuring they moved lightly to avoid making any noise. He took a long breath. After preparing the tools, he controlled the raven S to hold one end of the thin tubes to the door of each room, then slowly stretched the thin tubes through the crack of the door. He was very careful with this step, completing it room by room to avoid touching the door and setting off the alarm. Once everything was in place, Anduin opened the valve of the gas tank next to him. The gas passed through the main pipe, diverter, and thin tubes, quickly diffusing into the bedrooms of several people. Inhaling ether with a concentration of 3% exceeding 2 milliliters will cause a coma. Based on the area of their rooms, they should lose consciousness in about 3 minutes. Just to be safe, let's wait for 4 minutes, but not too long. If the concentration is too high, it could cause death. I hope none of them have heart disease, otherwise they can only consider themselves unlucky. Anduin thought to himself as he checked the time on his pocket watch. When he had investigated the layout of the house earlier, he found that all the rooms seemed to be redecorated to accommodate so many people. 5 rooms were temporarily stitched together by magic. Each room was about the same size, and the doors didn't fit the frames very well. The gap at the bottom of the doors was much wider than normal, and the windows were tightly closed. This gave him the idea to use an anesthetic liquid like ether to incapacitate these individuals. Low-concentration ether can be used as an anesthetic in medicine, but if used indiscriminately, it is a dangerous poison. Although it is a liquid in its normal state, it is extremely volatile and can cause lung burns if inhaled. It is also flammable and explosive, making it a very dangerous industrial material. Anduin had found some low-concentration ether after a long search. He had gone to a nearby chemical warehouse and managed to gather all the necessary equipment. Using magic to steal things was indeed convenient. He used invisibility, magic to open doors, and a space bag to store the items. However, finding the materials he needed was the more challenging part. 4 minutes passed, and Anduin, who had been keeping track of the time, quickly closed the valve. He then controlled the little raven still inside the house to go to the door and lightly peck at it, triggering the warning magic on the door to test the reaction of the Death Eaters. After 2 repeated attempts, there was no movement in the house. It seemed to be a success. Overjoyed, Anduin quickly disassembled the gas tank and put on a gas mask. He had to be careful with this kind of poisonous gas. End of this chapter. Chapter 159, Binding Play. Anduin, prepared and ready, used an advanced levitation spell to fly to a window facing the small living room on the 3rd floor. With ease, he opened the window using an unlocking spell. Inside, weak and high-frequency auras flickered, indicating that the warning magic was active. Unfortunately for their masters, they were unconscious at this time. The looking glass above the small living room was spinning rapidly, emitting a bright light to alert of the intrusion. Anduin quickly cast a freezing spell on it, silencing the alarm. Moving swiftly, he entered a bedroom, ignoring the flickering lights of various warning spells around him. He went straight to the bed, confiscated the wand from the Death Eater, and bound them with a quick imprisonment spell. He then opened the windows to ventilate the room, as the ether in the air posed a risk of combustion. After securing all 5 bedrooms, Anduin moved the unconscious individuals to the 2nd floor and closed the curtains. He then took the time to release the house's security magic. The 5 Death Eaters had inhaled an overdose of ether and showed no signs of waking up, but they were still alive, which suited Anduin's plans. It took nearly half an hour to lift the warning spells in the house and thoroughly ventilate it using magic. Anduin then cast multiple shielding spells on the house to prevent any noise from escaping and causing trouble. After completing his preparations, Anduin checked his pocket watch. It's exactly 12 o'clock. Time is tight. I need to finish this before 6 in the morning, he thought. Without wasting any more time, he approached the unconscious Death Eaters, took out his Return Me Piao Piao fist, and delivered several heavy punches to each of them, instantly waking them up. Ah! Screams and cries of pain echoed through the room. The Death Eaters, disoriented and in pain, looked around in confusion. They had been sleeping, but now found themselves lying on the second floor, tightly bound by magical chains, unable to move. Suddenly, a bright light appeared out of thin air. A magical ball of light floated to the ceiling, illuminating the room. The sudden brightness hurt their eyes, and they squinted until they adjusted to the light. They heard the sound of metal utensils being handled, followed by a voice. "I'm sorry, I forgot you can't see in the dark. I remembered to light a lamp for you now." As their vision cleared, Karkaroff saw a young, handsome, black-haired boy standing nearby. On a shelf beside him were various tools: pliers, a slender metal pick with a clock-like dial, metal chains, a thick needle syringe, and several empty potion bottles. "Who are you? Why are you here? Why did you tie us up? Let us go! Help!" Karkaroff shouted, struggling against his bonds. "It's you. How did you find this place? This is a private residence. Are you looking for death? How dare you break into the Travers family's place without permission? Let us go now." Yaxley recognized Anduin and snarled at him, his eyes red with anger. "Okay, Yaxley, don't you see it? This guy obviously came prepared. What do you think is the point of barking?" Torquil remained calm, watching Anduin with a smile. "Anduin, I know you. We met at King's Cross Station, didn't we? Tell me, what do you want to do?" "He's a smart guy. It's thanks to Yaxley that I found you. I'm relieved to see that you've been well taken care of. As for what I'm going to do, why don't you try to guess?" Anduin replied casually, continuing to pull various tools from his bag. Everyone turned to Yaxley in shock and anger upon hearing Anduin's words. Yaxley, looking innocent, shouted, "No, I didn't. This guy is lying. Don't trust this mudblood." "Don't be provoked by him," Torquil interrupted loudly. He then turned to Anduin and sneered. "Anduin, I admit you're courageous and clever to get past the security here. You just want to stand up for your friend Charles, don't you?" "So you think so?" Anduin chuckled, finally stopping what he was doing. He tilted his head a half and said, "If I just wanted to avenge my friend, you would have died 100 times over by now. I have other reasons for keeping you alive." Anduin turned to the crowd. "On one hand, I have some questions that need answering. On the other hand, my resources are running low, so I need to make use of you." He flashed a strange smile at the people lying on the ground. "What do you want to know?" Torquil asked, secretly trying to gather his magic. He was proficient in casting spells without a wand, but his lungs felt like they were burning. He had been hit several times and was in too much pain to concentrate, so he tried to buy time. "For you Death Eaters, will you answer honestly if I ask you? And don't bother trying to gather your magic. If you manage to cast a spell, I'll consider myself the loser," Anduin said with a smile, noticing Torquil's subtle movements. Realizing his plan had been seen through, Torquil hesitated and began to chant a spell under his breath. If delaying didn't work, he would have to fight. He didn't believe a young wizard could outmatch them without some kind of trickery. Gore and Crab, standing beside Torquil, quickly reacted and began muttering spells as well. Though their skill level was average, they could still cast a few spells without wands. But Anduin didn't give them a chance. He suddenly leaped up and swung his knuckle-covered right fist at their heads. The severe pain instantly dissipated the magical energy they had painstakingly gathered. End of this chapter. Chapter 160, In Vivo Experiment. 1. A fist is faster within 2 meters. Haven't your parents taught you that? Be honest, my time is very precious, Anduin said coldly. Seeing that all the experimental equipment was ready, Anduin didn't bother to talk nonsense with these guys. He sealed everyone's mouths with a spell, then went to each of them and started to search their bodies. It was the season to test the harvest. Under the malicious eyes of several Death Eaters, Anduin took stock of his loot, more than 600 gold galleons, a letter, a lot of silver jewelry, some sundries, and daily necessities. He also found a small leather bag on Torquil's body. After checking it, he discovered it was an alchemy item cast with the no-trace stretching curse. Most of the funds were found inside it. Putting these things back into the leather bag and securing it, Anduin punched Torquil again and said with a smile, "I'm ashamed you ran out with such a little thing. I'm really ashamed for you." Torquil bared his teeth in pain after being punched hard, but still stared at Anduin viciously. Anduin didn't care about this. He lifted the spell sealing Torquil's mouth and said gently, "Next, I will use your body. Don't worry, I will be very gentle and won't break you. Of course, he thought to himself, I'll try my best. Anduin walked to the tool table next to him, picked up a long metal pick with a dial. It looked like a European kitchen thermometer, and walked towards them. First of all, let's test this magic power measuring instrument. The previous in vitro test couldn't accurately measure the magic power reserve in a wizard's body. Now we can only find another way to try the in vivo test, Anduin said to himself. Tokiel, lying on the ground, watched Anduin approach with an unknown object. The hairs on his body suddenly stood up for some reason, and he looked at him nervously. What are you doing? Don't come here. I am the second heir to the Travers family. I advise you. Ah! Just as Tokiel was about to threaten Anduin with weak words, Anduin had already walked to his side and, with a poof, plunged the entire metal stick straight into Tokiel's chest. Blood seeped out uncontrollably, but Anduin used a spell to tighten the wound, finally stopping the bleeding. The four people around were completely stunned. They didn't expect Anduin to be so cruel. He was about to kill someone. Anduin ignored the gazes around him and focused on the dashboard on the metal pick. Strange, why isn't there any response? After engraving the runes of blood sensing, integrity, monitoring, blood, life, and control, it should be able to monitor the magic value. The original in vitro test could sense it, but the accuracy was too low. Could it be that the sensitivity coefficient is adjusted too high? Anduin pulled out the metal pick with a blank expression, made some adjustments to the dashboard, and then inserted it into Tokiel's chest again with a poof. I'm sorry. I was a little distracted just now. It seems I inserted it in the wrong direction and another hole came out. But don't worry, I will fix it for you in a while, Anduin said with some embarrassment, looking at another bloody hole. Ah! Tokiel couldn't bear it any longer and roared ferociously. You damn guy, kill me if you want. What are you going to do to me? He struggled and twisted his body in pain, but he was still firmly pressed to the ground under the suppression of Anduin's obstacle curse. Anduin ignored Tokiel's yelling. He had now devoted himself to the research work, focusing all his attention on the instrument. Yes, the amplitude of the scale pointer is stable, and there is no irregular bounce in the in vitro experiment. It seems. It is feasible to measure the magic power reserve in a living body, Anduin stated confidently. He then turned his attention back to Tokiel, who was pinned to the ground. How do you feel now? Do you have any other discomfort besides the pain? Tokiel, writhing in agony with a burning sensation in his chest, could hardly believe Anduin had the audacity to ask about his condition. His response was a mix of vicious curses, scolding, and wails that would make anyone's skin crawl. There are no adverse reactions to the receptors, and the mind is normal. Currently, using blood magic to measure magic power has no obvious side effects, Anduin noted, observing Tokiel's feedback. He nodded and jotted down his observations on the recording board in his hand. He then compared the pointer scale on the measuring instrument and recorded the value of Tokiel's magic power reserve. Anduin had named the unit of magic power ticks, as the instrument panel displayed scales. 1 tick was defined by the standard casting of the luminescence spell, which consumed 1 unit of mana. Luminescence was the spell that required the least mana among wizard spells, making it the most suitable unit. Initially, Anduin considered using the levitation spell as the benchmark, but since it involved continuous casting with inconsistent mana consumption, he opted for luminescence instead. Tokiel's current measured magic power was 637 ticks, meaning he could cast the luminescence spell 637 times before depleting his mana. For comparison, a standard D-weapon spell consumed roughly 3 ticks of magic power. This meant Tokiel's magic power was sufficient to cast the D-weapon spell over 200 times. Compared to minor wizards, Tokiel's magic power reserves were roughly 4 times that of a third-year wizard. Judging by this value, Tokiel is still quite strong. Very good. Let's test whether emotional fluctuations will significantly affect the mana value, Anduin mused. He put away the recording board, donned his knuckles again, and punched Tokiel's chest, targeting the wound that had been inflicted earlier. The knuckles were inscribed with a pain-intensifying rune, amplifying Tokiel's agony. Tokiel, already exhausted from Anduin's previous torture, let out a guttural howl. His hoarse voice, like a rusty saw, grated on everyone's eardrums, making the 4 people nearby feel his pain acutely. The empty space around them seemed to amplify the fear in their hearts, causing some to tremble uncontrollably.